Welcome everyone, both on Zoom and Facebook Live. It's a pleasure to be learning with you on the first day of our Sphira Zman. This is the fifth session of Mishnah in Depth Nazir with Avie Walfish. It is Mishnah in Depth Nazir, and we will continue with Sotah. Rabbi Walfish is going to be sharing sources on the screen. I will post a link to in chat. This class, along with our other Mishnah courses, is a project of the Grisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. I hope if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask in chat, whether on Zoom or on Facebook Live. I will be sending promotions to panelists so that you can unmute yourself, ask questions more directly, turn on your camera, which is great for making for a Beit Midrash environment, if possible. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Walfish.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. We have to fill in a few things from chapter 6. We started looking at chapter 6 of Nazir last time. I want to add a few points, and then we will move on to the last 3 chapters of Nazir. They're brief chapters, so most weeks we've done 2 chapters. This week we will be doing 3. Okay, so chapter 6, we noted that there's some very interesting word plays at the beginning of the chapter. One of them has to do with the word zug. Okay, the word zug in Mishnah 2 is a kind of a simile for the word zag. Okay, the parts of the grape that the Torah says are forbidden to the Nazir include the zag and the chartzan, and there's a dispute here in the Nazir Perek Vav Mishnah Bet. Okay, that's what you have up on the screen here. Which is the peel and which is the pit. And in explaining when Rabbi Yossi explains how he knows that the zag is the outer part, the chartzan is the inner part. That, by the way, is how it's used in modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew, we use chartzan to mean the great pit. How do we know that the chartzan is the inner part and the outer part is called the zag? So he compares it to a zug. Okay, zug in this case means a bell. Okay, like the bell they put on animals. Okay, so that you can keep track of where your animals are. You put a bell on them, and the outer part of the bell is called the zug. The inner part, okay, the ringer, the clanger, is called the inbal. Okay, so that's one use of the term zug in that Mishnah. But in the next Mishnah, Mishnah Gimel, it says, if you look at the second line here on the screen, Nazir shegilach ben bezug ben betar. Okay, so tar means a razor. Okay, and zug in this case means a scissors. So the same word zug is used as an explanation for the grape products that a Nazir cannot have, and for the scissors that a Nazir is not allowed to use to cut his hair. Okay, and we noted very briefly last time that this wordplay that connects eating, the eating of grapes, drinking of wine, which is one of the prohibitions of Nazir, and the other prohibition of not cutting the hair, this linguistic associative connection actually echoes something we have in the Torah. The word Nazir itself, okay, way back when we started learning Masechet Nazir, we noted that the word Nazir itself has two roots, miyayin v'shechar yazir, okay, to separate himself from wine and other kinds of grape products. Okay, shechar is we would normally translate it as beer, but it seems to be some kind of also a grape product, not exactly wine, but something akin to it. So that's yazir, to separate himself, and also ki nezer elokav al rosho. Okay, the crown of God is upon his head, and that's referring to the hair. The growth of hair is a divine crown upon his head. So the Torah already sort of vacillates between two meanings of Nazir. Nazir as separating himself from wine and grape products. Nazir as growing a divine head of hair, which you don't violate by cutting it. Later on, the Torah says you also don't violate it by defiling it through contact with the dead, because contact with the dead not only defiles the person of the Nazir, but the Torah stresses it defiles his head. And so he has to shave off. He has to purify himself, then shave off that hair. Point we'll be coming back to in a little while. So that term Nazir actually in the Torah also connects these two aspects of Nazirut. This idea that there's some kind of interconnection between these two aspects of Nazir, something that the Torah indicates with one word play, and Chazal very creatively indicate through another word play. These comparisons also become explicit in chapter 6, starting with Mishnah 5. Okay, in Mishnah 5, the Mishnah says Shlosha minim asurin b'nazir, 3 prohibitions, an opening sentence that echoes the opening sentence of the chapter. Okay, in 6:1, also Shlosha minim asurin b'nazir, but there it was just to present the 3 prohibitions. Here it's in order to compare and contrast the 3 prohibitions. And the Mishnah goes on to say that each one of these prohibitions has certain characteristics that others don't have. Okay, for example, drinking wine does not cancel any of his period of Nazirut. It's a violation; he's punished for it, but his Nazirut continues. Okay, it's unsullied. The Nazirut. He did something wrong, but his Nazirut continues. Whereas cutting the hair or becoming defiled will cancel a period of Nazirut. As the Mishnah points out, they don't cancel exactly the same period of Nazirut. There's certain differences, which we don't have time. That's one of the big challenges of this kind of framework. This is called Mishnah in depth. But to do Mishnah in depth and to cover 2 chapters a week on the average, okay, is something of an oxymoron. Okay, so we can go in depth, but up to a point. Okay, so as we've done in previous classes, we're going to allude to a lot of ideas that we're going to put on the table, throw out, and not necessarily develop the way they should be developed. So this is worth, obviously, much further investigation. But for our purposes, we'll just note in passing that the Mishnah is very interested in comparing and contrasting these 3 different aspects of Nazirut. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of them. The Mishnah has 1 or 2 additional comparisons that it spells out. but that brings me back to my point as to the wordplay that doesn't contrast as much as bind together the different aspects of Nazirut. Okay, the Nazirut is like a package deal. Even though these are different things, but they belong together. And the Torah binds them together with a wordplay on the word Nazir itself. Chazal in the Mishnah bind them together among other methods of doing so, using the wordplay with the word zug. There are some other interesting wordplays in the chapter, which we'll unfortunately have to skip. But let's raise the question. Let's think just very briefly, but just to get some kind of insight as to how these things interplay. So first, let's note the difference. Abstaining from wine is perhaps a form of asceticism. I mentioned in one of the earlier classes that there is some question to what extent Nazirut is a form of asceticism. Aaron Shemesh, of blessed memory, who wrote a book published posthumously a few years ago about the Tanaitic approach to Nazir, argues that in fact there's nothing really ascetic about Nazirut. Abstaining from wine is not a tremendous hardship. He doesn't really see it as a form of asceticism. Many other scholars think otherwise, and I'm not really going to go into that issue, but it's a lifestyle issue, okay? And as we noted frequently as we went through Tractate Nazir, a lot of echoes in Tractate Nazir of Tractate Nidarim. Nidarim certainly focuses very heavily on things from which a person abstains, and Masechet Nazir also is very largely about abstention. A Nazir spends a period of time abstaining from certain pleasures in which most people indulge, whether it's a form of asceticism or whether it's a way of sanctifying his way of life. For other reasons, we had a Mishnah back in chapter 2 that seemed to indicate that, it could be a kind of ancient form of Alcoholics Anonymous. You fortify your resolve to abstain from wine by taking this vow. That's a lifestyle issue. Growing the hair long, the Torah indicates very clearly, is making yourself into a sacred person. Your body, your very body, attains a certain level of sanctity, and this is a theme we'll be developing further a little further on. Okay, and by combining these two, I think the Mishnah is indicating that you can't really have one without the other. The abstention is a function of the fact that you have made yourself into a different person. You have transformed your personality, okay, in a certain way. I'm not saying necessarily psychologically or existentially, but certainly halachically. Okay, you've taken on a new character. I'm not just an ordinary person. I am a Nazir. Nazir has sanctity. A sanctified person will not engage in some of the pleasures in which the run-of-the-mill people engage. Part of his sanctity is to abstain from wine. Okay, so in that sense, the abstention is an outgrowth of the personal status. And you can say the reverse as well. The abstention is a way of creating the personal status. Personal status is not just symbolic by not cutting the hair. Okay, that sort of makes your appearance something that pronounces your sanctity, but that's not enough. There has to be something in your way of life that expresses that sanctity, and perhaps I would say even fosters that sanctity. Okay, so I think by combining these, the Mishnah is indicating that personal sanctity always has to involve these two things. there is something there about the very presence of a person. Okay, his being in the world, the way he presents himself to the world, okay, is part of his sanctity. Okay, and by the same token, his sanctity has to be his sanctity has to be fortified and perhaps in a sense produced by the kind of life that he leads. And the Mishnah fortifies that idea, cements that idea by binding them together linguistically. Now, another thing that comes up in the second part of chapter 6 is again a point that's too important to skip over. Starting in Mishnah 6, there are a few Mishnayot that are devoted to the shaving. Okay, now the shaving, again, a point we've noted in the past, and it certainly bears repeating. The shaving is not just shaving. The shaving is part of a ceremony. And there are two kinds of shaving. There's shaving for tum'ah, for the Nazir who has become defiled, so he has to shave in order to restart his Nazirut. He purifies himself, he shaves himself, he brings sacrifices, and that's the other part. The shaving always goes hand in hand with a sacrificial service. So for the tum'ah, for the Nazir who has become defiled, so the shaving and the sacrificial service are to restart the Nazirut. At the conclusion of the period of Nazirut, then he also has to shave off his hair, bring sacrifices, okay, and part of the ceremony is taking the hair that he shaved off and using it as part of the sacrificial service, a very unusual part of the sacrificial service. The hair of the Nazir is not offered on the altar. What is done with it is based on a pasuk in the Torah, which we won't take the time to look at, but we will look at how the Mishnah describes it. Okay, look here in Mishnah Chet, next to last or third line. Hayanotel sa'ar rosh nizro umishaleach tachat hadud. You throw it into the fire on which the shlamim sacrifice. There's a ram that's brought as a shlamim offering. That seems to be the most important of the sacrificial offerings of the Nazir. It's certainly the one that he and anyone whom he invites will partake of, will consume. It's a shlamim offering. So while it's being cooked, the hair of the Nazir is thrown into the fire. So it contributes to the consumption of this particular sacrifice. So that's the sacrificial role that it plays. Okay, now the interesting thing here, there are many interesting things, obviously, but the interesting thing that we will focus on for our purposes right now is the Mishnah has a dispute which shaving of the Nazir will bring about the throwing the hair into the fire. Okay, so there are different factors that go into it. First of all, do we differentiate between the shaving for purification and the shaving at the end of the Nazirut period? A second differentiation is what happens if the person, instead of shaving his head off, shaving off the hair on his head, in the precincts of the temple as part of the service, what if he does it outside of the temple? Okay, now let's say the Nazir shaves off his head and then brings it to the temple. Okay, will that also be burnt in the same way? Okay, so there's a dispute on that point. Again, we don't have time to go into the ins and out of that dispute, but just a thought as to why this is an important and interesting question. Okay, the question is whether shaving the head of the Nazir is just an act of its own that indicates that's it. I have completed my Nazirut. Okay, I grew my hair long, and now to end my Nazirut, I shave it off. Or I became defiled as a Nazir, and so now, in order to restart my Nazirut, I have to restart my growth of hair by shaving the head. Because that makes the shaving something more technical, something that stands alone. When you take the hair and throw it into the fire on which a sacrifice is being cooked, then you're making the shaving into something symbolic. You're making it into a ritual. The shaving is not just a way of ending a period, either the period of impurity or the period of Nazirut entirely. The shaving is part of a ceremony. You are ceremoniously shaving off the head. Now, there's a Mishnah elsewhere that also bears on this issue. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at this other Mishnah. Yeah, got it. Okay, Mishnah of all places in Tractate Nigaim. Nigaim is all about the laws of leprosy. And the Mishnah in the last chapter of Nigaim, by the way, leprosy doesn't really mean leprosy. Leprosy in current medical parlance means what is technically called Hansen's disease, which has nothing to do with what we incorrectly term leprosy in the Torah. But it's some kind of disease, obviously some kind of skin disease, to which the Torah accords halachic standing, and it's generally seen being some kind of divine sign. God sends leprosy or this disease, tzarat, upon an individual, or sometimes upon his clothing, or sometimes upon his house. Okay, and we usually understand that to be some kind of divine message that the person has to understand, and that's why it's also treated in not by doctors but by kohanim. Okay, and the kohen has to declare him to be a mitzorah, has to declare him to be healed, and the kohen has to preside over a whole series of rituals that will purify the mitzorah. Part of it is shaving not only his head hair, but all of the hair on his body. That's part of the end of the period of tzarat. And Mishnah Nigaim combines with that a third example in the Torah of shaving. Shlosha Megalchin, says the Mishnah, v'tiglachtan mitzvah. There are three who have a mitzvah to shave. Okay, hanazir v'amitzorah v'alavim. Part of the inauguration process of the Leviim, okay, in the book of Bamidbar, when they were initiated into their role as helpers of the Kohanim and working in the Mishkan, so part of it was to shave their hair. Okay, and the Mishnah says, "V'chulan shegilchu shelo betar o sheshiru shtei sarot lo atzu klum." Okay, and in all cases, in order to be a fulfillment of the mitzvah, it must be done with a razor, which normally would be forbidden. Okay, it's certainly forbidden to shave off part of the head, the beard, with a razor. And But in these cases, it's a mitzvah to do it, the beard, the head, okay, and in the case of the Leviim and Mitzoraim, all of the body, okay? And you're not allowed to leave behind 2 hairs unshaven. And this Mishnah seems clearly to indicate that in all 3 cases, this is a ritual performance. Shaving is in and of itself a ritual, okay? And in all cases, it's combined with certain kinds of sacrificial procedures. Okay, so this Mishnah is also relevant to the discussion here in Tractate Nazir about the correct way to approach the shaving. Okay, notice that. But it seems here in Tractate Nazir that not every shaving is ritual. Okay, perhaps only the shaving in the temple of a Nazir who has completed his term, that is certainly something ritual and has to be done in this ritual way, and throwing the hair into the fire under the sacrifice. The other kinds of shaving, if A, it's done outside of the temple, and or B, if it's shaving for someone who is impure, then that might not be the case. That's the dispute here. Again, interesting to think about, but I think the important takeaway for us is this idea that that shaving, at least the standard shaving at the end of the Nazirut period, is performing a ritual function. Now, this in turn raises an interesting question, and scholars have debated this question as well. What's the relationship between the term of the Nazir and the ritual that ends his Nazirut? Okay, we tend to think of it as he was a Nazir for a period of time. That's the important thing. To live as a Nazir for a period of time, that is the main point of Nazirut. And then at the time you end it, so there's a ritual to end it. You do all kinds of symbolic things to perhaps express what you're taking away from this experience with you. And so you shave off the hair and bring the sacrifices and weave them together. And that sort of solidifies the experience and gives you a take-home message from your period of Nazirut. But it's entirely possible that it actually works in reverse. Okay, some of you may recall we learned at one point the story of the Nazir from the south, whom Shimon HaTzadik praised, the one who reminds us very much of Narcissus. Okay, and his whole purpose in becoming a Nazir was in order to shave off his hair for the honor of God. Okay, in other words, he was less interested in living as a Nazir, and living as a Nazir for him was simply a preparation for offering his hair to God, which I think we can readily see as a kind of symbolic self-offering, self-sacrifice. Okay, Judaism does not accept human sacrifice. We had one example of near human sacrifice, which the Torah both praises very highly. Okay, obviously I'm talking about the Akedah, okay, Akedat Yitzchak. The Torah on the one hand praises Avraham and by extension, presumably Yitzchak, for their role and behavior in that event, but at the same time indicates very clearly it's good to be willing to do it, but not to actually do it. Real human sacrifice is anathema to the Torah. One of the most egregious sins throughout the Torah is the molech, which is a form of human sacrifice. So the Torah definitely utterly rejects the notion Gehinom, which is the classic Jewish word for what we call hell, is actually the place where sacrifices were made to the Molech. That's the most evil place on earth, is where human beings are sacrificed. But symbolic human sacrifice appears in more than one area of halacha, and Nazirut seems to be one of them. You shave off the hair, make an offering out of it, and maybe that's what the whole period of Nazirut is really building up to. I live a sanctified period of my life so that at the end, my body has become sanctified, and particularly my head of hair has become sanctified, and that head of hair can now be offered to God. So these are two different perspectives on how to view Nazirut, both of them growing out of this understanding that the shaving is not just a technical act, but is perceived as a ritual act. And this idea itself leads us into the opening of chapter 7. Because the opening of chapter 7 raises a very interesting halachic question, which in turn, as interesting halachic questions tend to do, raises some very interesting conceptual, and I would argue even theological and existential issues. If a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir, now what do a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir have in common? So first of all, what they have in common halachically is that the Torah prohibits both of them from defiling themselves through contact with the dead, even for close relatives. Most Kohanim are prohibited from contact with death, except for funerals of close relatives. That is not only permissible, that's even a mitzvah. Kohen Gadol and Nazir are the two exceptions. And interestingly, the Torah already indicates this connection. We already mentioned the pasuk about the Nazir. Ki nezer elokav al rosho. The crown of God is upon his head. That's his hair. And there's a very similar pasuk in Vayikra chapter 21, pasuk Yud Bet. Pasuk will be reading for Parshat HaShavua in a couple of weeks. And the pasuk is Ki nezer elokav al rosho. The Kohen Gadol also has a nezer of God on his head. What is the nezer, the crown of God on the head of the Kohen? He doesn't grow his hair long. If anything, he's prohibited from growing his hair long. Okay, Kohanim in general and Kohen Gadol in particular must cut their hair on a regular basis. That's part of keeping the proper appearance before the public whom they're serving. Okay, so what is the crown of God upon his head? Very likely, it's the tzitz, right? On his forehead, he wears the name of God. Okay, the golden diadem that he wears on his forehead, on which it says Kodesh Lashem, sanctified to God. That's very likely the nezer that he has on his head. The Kohen Gadol is also anointed on his head. Okay, maybe not only on his head, but certainly on his head. Okay, the anointing of the Kohen Gadol, that could also be the crown of God upon his head. So the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol share this feature of having a crown of God, and that's why they can't defile themselves through contact with the dead, even for close relatives. And now the question that comes up here in the Mishnah is, what if the two of them are walking together along the road and they encounter a meit mitzvah. This is the one exception for both of them where they should defile themselves. When there is a person who has nobody else to bury them. Person who dies, no known relatives. Who's going to bury this person? Somebody has to. And you're out in the middle of nowhere. So who's going to be that someone? You. No one else. Can't get anyone else to come. So the Kohen Gadol, who encounters a meit mitzvah, will defile himself for this great mitzvah. By the way, what is so crucially important about meit mitzvah is the notion of kavod habriot. Okay, human dignity. Human dignity is an overarching value in Judaism. Doesn't override anything and everything, but as we can see, it overrides even the sanctity of a Kohen Gadol or the sanctity of a Nazir. And now the question is, what if they're both on the road together and they encounter a meit mitzvah? One of them has to defile himself. Which one should do it? Okay, so as we might expect, this is after all a Jewish text, so there is a machloket. Okay, so you have Rabbi Eliezer who says, not the Nazir, the Kohen Gadol should defile himself. The Chachamim say no, Dafka the Nazir should defile himself. And what are the considerations here? Okay, so let's start with, I think we would probably intuitively agree with the Chachamim. Let's start with their argument at the end of Mishnah Aleph. Amru lo yitaman Nazir shein kedushato, kedushat olam. The Nazir is only temporarily sanctified. Okay, he took upon himself sanctity for 30 days, let's say. The end of the 30 days, he goes back to being an average everyday person. So he shouldn't defile himself for no reason, but this is a very important reason. Kohen Gadol, that's a lifetime position. His very person is sacred as a Kohen Gadol. The Nazir, okay, comes and goes, his sanctity. But interestingly, Rabbi Eliezer gives a counter argument. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, the Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol, when he becomes defiled, what does he have to do? Purify himself, that's it. Purifies himself, he's back in business. The Nazir, it's not enough for him to purify himself. He has to re-sanctify himself by bringing sacrifices. He has to undo the defilement, not just by purification, but by sacrifices, and thereby restart his sanctity. So because of that, his defilement is actually more serious than that of the Kohen Gadol. Okay, so I think the halakhic argumentation here, I think, is very interesting. Not that common in the Mishnah to see such developed halachic argumentation. It happens occasionally, but not all that frequently. But I think there's also a philosophical issue at stake here. I think the issue is whether the higher form of sanctity is the sanctity that grows out of like an objective reality. The Kohen Gadol, once he has been appointed and sanctified, first of all, he was born a Kohen. He had nothing to do with that. That's a matter of birth. And when we upgraded his priesthood to be Kohen Gadol, that now becomes part of his person. Let's say, for example, for some reason, he can no longer function as Kohen Gadol, and someone else replaces him. He retains his sanctity. Okay, Ma'alin Bakodesh v'lo moridin. In other words, the sanctity becomes absorbed into his very person. Okay, it's metaphysical sanctity. And the Nazir is voluntarily assumed and temporary sanctity. Now, that voluntarily assumed and temporary sanctity, we would think that's less. The Kohen Gadol, it's like God has sanctified him. God anointed him, right? The anointing is like God coming down and saying, you now have become a different person, a different individual. The Nazir, it's a temporary position. That's the position of the Chachamim. But Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying that actually the humanly conferred, when a human being assumes something, that temporary sanctity that he assumes is actually higher than the sanctity of a Kohen Gadol. Now, this links up with a much broader question. Okay, let's say, for example, what is more sanctified? Shabbat, where God confers the sanctity, or festivals where man confers the sanctity? Mikadesh Yisrael Basmanim, we sanctify the new month. By sanctifying the new month, we create the sanctity of the festival. Which of them is more sanctified? Okay, well, we tend to think that the answer is Shabbat is more sanctified, and that's not an incorrect answer. The penalty for violating Shabbat is greater than the penalty for violating festivals. But we violate the Shabbat in order to sanctify the festivals, right? In order for the witnesses to come and testify about the new moon, they'll violate the Shabbat. So it's actually not so clear that one is more sacred than the other. In some respects, one is more sacred. In other respects, the other is more sacred. And that, I think, is very characteristic of rabbinic thought, that things that human beings create can sometimes even supersede the things that God has created. Sanctity conferred by man may, in certain ways, in certain respects, actually supersede the sanctity created directly by God. Okay, again, a huge issue. Okay, we just touched on it, but I think it's interesting to see how the Mishnah notes that point here. And it bears noting as well that this is not the first time we're encountering this notion. Because at the very beginning of the tractate, we noted that in addition to the standard Nazirut, where a person takes upon himself temporary Nazirut, there are two other forms. There's Nazir Olam, where the person takes on an unending series of Naziruyot. The minute one ends, the next one begins. So he will forever be a Nazir, but each Nazirut is only temporary. And he will shave at the end of a Nazirut and bring his sacrifices, and then immediately restart the next one. So that's another model. It's lifetime Nazirut, but each one is only temporary. Then there's a completely different kind of Nazirut called Nazirut Shimshon. And Shimshon was a Nazir from birth. He was born a Nazir, he died a Nazir. And his Nazirut can't be defiled. He doesn't ever shave off his hair. He doesn't ever have to bring sacrifices to restart his Nazirut, because his Nazirut is inherent in his very being. And so, the same way the Mishnah compared those kinds of Nazirut at the beginning, now that we're comparing the sanctity of the Nazir to the sanctity of a high priest, we're revisiting some of those issues from a different angle. And, again, we had time, we would talk more about what did we say about the three-way comparison there, and how does that compare with the two-way comparison here. Okay, point for discussion, but something we will not have opportunity to go into. Okay, let me just say something very brief about the next couple of Mishnayot in chapter 7, which talk about corpse impurity. and its impact on Nazirut. We've been talking a lot about when he's defiled through contact with death. But not every contact with death will defile the Nazir and require him to shave off his hair and bring the sacrifices. Okay, and the Mishnah lists in Mishnah Bet which ones do, and then in Mishnah Gimel which ones do not. Okay, this is a big topic, very intricate. Just one point to note briefly, and that is that some of the points in this list are surprising. Okay, because if you look in Tractate Ohalot, which is the main source for corpse impurity, you'll see that some of the things that defile in a tent, they're considered to be full-fledged corpse impurity, even to the point where if you're in the same tent as this part of a corpse, then you become impure. And some of them will not defile the Nazir. And I'll just, in other words, will not require him to shave his hair. And I'll just mention the two most prominent examples. Okay, here in the third line, Chatzi Kav Atzamot is what will require the Nazir to shave his head. But if you encounter part of a corpse in a tent, it's half of that amount of bones that will defile you in a tent. Chatzi log dam, similarly. Half a log of dam will require the Nazir to shave. A quarter of a log will be enough to defile people under normal circumstances. Okay, now that's surprising and puzzling, and I think that surprise is really what underlies Mishnah Dalet, because Rabbi Eliezer says in the name of Rabbi Yoshua that he compares two things: defiling a Nazir and entering the temple. An interesting comparison in its own right. Seems to be indicating the Nazir is a kind of personal temple. As a Nazir, he is like a temple. And so what defiles him is what will obligate a person to atone for having violated the sanctity of the Mikdash, of the temple. Okay? And then he says, and vice versa. If it's the sort of tumah for which a Nazir will not shave, then he will also not have to bring a sacrifice for having violated the sanctity of the temple. And Rabbi Meir says, what are you talking about? You violate the sanctity of the temple if you have touched a dead creature and then entered the Mikdash, which is a much less serious form of defilement than contact with the dead. So obviously, even forms of impurity that will not require a Nazir to shave his head will not, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't defile the temple if you have contracted that kind of impurity. And at the end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yoshua explains to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva also thought something along these lines, and Rabbi Yoshua said to him, no, you're wrong. Yafeh amarta, your logic is impeccable. Elakein amru halacha. These things are halacha. Halacha means tradition. We have traditions, so what to make of all this is, again, not an issue we can go into. Just one brief thought, which is that corpse impurity is an area of halacha which is shrouded in mystery, pun intended. Okay, the idea that you come into contact with dead brings man into contact with an area of reality which remains to him mysterious, challenging, on all kinds of levels, including the theological level. How do we make sense of it? How do we cope with it? Okay, we're Now, here in Israel already, we're observing Yom HaShoah, okay, where this is a very real and powerful and burning issue, especially this year when we underwent our own mini Shoah, okay, certainly not the Shoah, but too many aspects that are much too reminiscent of the Shoah. In another week, we'll be observing Yom HaZikaron, which again will take on added pain and poignancy this year. And that's the mystery of death. Okay, that's where man comes up short. And so maybe that's part of the idea here. Logically, it would seem to us that whatever creates corpse impurity will defile the Nazir. And we say no. Some yes, some no. Why? The Mishnah itself seems to be throwing up its hands and saying we don't really understand. It's halakha. We have these traditions. We may not understand them. Our logic may not comprehend them, but that doesn't mean that we are free to ignore those halachot. Let's move on to chapter 8. Okay, now, chapter 8 is a very brief chapter, one very long Mishnah and one short Mishnah. And the long Mishnah, we can't go through the permutations here, but the long Mishnah is basically about one issue, which is two Nazirim are walking along the road. Now it's not a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir walking along the road, two Nazirim walking along the road. And at the end of the road, someone approaches them and says, I saw one of you came into contact with a corpse, but I couldn't tell which one. One of you is Tameh and one of you is not. And that's a big problem because the Nazir who's been defiled has to purify himself and shave off his hair and bring sacrifices to restart the Nazirut. The one who's pure is not allowed to shave off his hair. So which one is supposed to shave off his hair? So the Mishnah finds a standard halachic kind of solution to it. Okay, you wait until the end of the 30-day period for both of them. The two of them together will bring a korban tohara and a korban tumah. And we'll say, whichever one of us needs to bring the sacrifices for ending the Nazirut, these sacrifices are his. Whichever one needs the other sacrifice, that was his. We don't know which is which, but it doesn't matter. And then at the end of another 30 days, then they'll bring another sacrifice of concluding, okay? And then they'll bring other sacrifices that will be offered as free will offerings, okay? And that's how they'll manage to square the circle. Okay, but the details are not so important. What's more important to my mind is, why is the Mishnah concerned about this? I have my doubts as to how practical the issue was. And then the Mishnah talks about, and what if one of them dies in the interim? How do they get out of it then? And then it becomes even more intricate. And there's a dispute how to do it. But why is the Mishnah dealing with that? I think less for practical reasons. And that's not even getting into the fact that the Mishnah is compiled when Nazirut was no longer a practice. Okay, Mishnah was compiled 130 years or so after the destruction of the temples. Obviously, there were no Nazirim at the time, but even beyond that, I think even at the time of the temple, this issue is more for its academic value and less for its practical value. And the academic value is that the Mishnah and Chazal in general were very, very fond of dealing with issues of doubt. What do I do when I don't know? How do I confront doubtful situations? in many cases, those issues of doubt really are practical. I mean, to this day, we often are dealing with issues of doubt and how do you handle these doubtful situations. But even beyond that, the Mishnah just likes to deal with situations of doubt, sometimes because situations of doubt help you to fine-tune your understanding of the underlying halachic concepts. And in Masechet Nazir, there might be an additional reason why this issue of doubt comes up. And that's something that I think we'll see when we look at chapter 9. Chapter 9 opens with something very surprising. Okay, I mean, we're not going to get right away to the issue of doubt. We'll be coming to it very soon. But first, a word or two about the first Mishnah. Hagoyim ein lahem nazirut, nashim v'avadim yesh lahem nazirut. Nazirut does apply to women and slaves. Slaves means Canaanite slaves who have undergone a kind of partial conversion. They're regarded as partially Jewish. So people who are within the orbit of Jewish identity, including women and avadim, do have Nazirut. Women having Nazirut we have encountered a few times already in the course of the tractate, most prominently in chapter 4, also at the end of chapter 3. Earlier I mentioned the Mishnah of the woman who took a neder nazirut to fortify her resolve to stop drinking because she had already drunk one or two too many. So we've seen the idea of women in nazirut. Okay, at the end of chapter 3, we had the example of Heleni Hamalka. Of Heleni Hamalka, okay, who accepted Nazirut. So the official statement that women can be Nazirut doesn't surprise us. The placing of it, I think, is surprising. Because these are the kinds of halachot that very often open halachic discussions. To whom does the mitzvah apply? That's very often how you open. Like take a tractate Arachin, opens with Goyim are not subject to Arachin, to certain kinds of sanctity vows, and Yisrael are. Okay, so here Goyim don't have Nazirut, but Jews, including Nashim Bavadim, do. Why is this at the end of the tractate rather than at the beginning? Okay, so a couple of thoughts here. Nashim, at the end of the tractate, may remind us that we are in Seder Nashim. Okay, why we talked at the end of the tractate Nidarim about why tractate Nidarim is in Seder Nashim. Okay, but here we can reflect on why is tractate Nazir in Seder Nashim. Okay, so maybe this is part of the reason. Okay, why Goyim don't have Nazirut? Perhaps the idea, remember that in the previous couple of chapters, the sanctity of the Nazir has been a main theme. So maybe that's the idea. Now that we know how sanctified a Nazir is, perhaps in a way even more sanctified than the Kohen Gadol, maybe that gives us a deeper understanding as to why Goyim ein lahem Nazirut. We don't consider them to be capable of attaining that level of sanctity. So if a Nazir is a sanctified person, he has to be a part of the Israelite community. So maybe it's not by accident that right here in the last chapter of Nazirut is where we focus on which people can become can become Nazirim. And then the chapter moves on to another theme. Since our time is running out, we'll end with this, and we'll leave over one very important point about Tractate Nazir for the next class. But let's conclude with the next topic, which takes up most of chapter 9. Mishnah Bet, the second Mishnah talks about a very unique concept that applies only to Nazir and to Korban Pesach. There's this same notion that we're about to mention that has applicability to a person who has become defiled in this way. Could he bring a Korban Pesach? Okay, so Korban Pesach will not interest us, but the Nazir part of it will. The notion is Tum'at HaTahom, a grave in the depths. Okay, now what does the depths mean? Literally, obviously, it means something buried somewhere down deep. Okay, Tahom we usually use to mean the depths of the ocean, but it can also mean the depths of the earth. Okay, so Tumat HaTahom, that's what it literally means. The way Chazal use it is a tum'ah that no one knows about. Okay, and here we're dealing once again with the notion of safek. And here's why I said that perhaps this chapter will give us an insight into the previous chapter. Previous chapter talked about a safek, which person became tameh. One of them became tameh, but we're not sure which. And the question is, what's the way out? How can the two of them together handle that situation? Here, we're talking about another kind of safek altogether, a very unique kind of safek, where a person knows that he became tameh, but he became tameh from a kind of tumah that no one knew about. There's a tumah that was unknown to anyone, as opposed to, for example, let's say Nazir is walking, case will come up elsewhere in the Mishnah. Nazir is walking along the road and he discovers that along the road he's been walking, somewhere there was an unmarked grave. Well, there's an unmarked grave. That means someone buried that person there, which means someone in the world knew about it. The Nazir didn't know about it. But, okay, now he knows. So he becomes tameh. There is something unique about a Nazir that if he finds out after the fact that he became tameh, and the source of tum'ah was something that no one in the world ever knew about. The person died alone. No one knew this person had died. No one knew this corpse was in that place. Okay, for example, you have a cave. Okay, he goes in. It's ironic. He goes in to purify himself in the cave, comes out of the cave and discovers a corpse floating there. Okay, and it's clear that he is the first one ever to enter this cave and encounter this corpse. Okay, so then we say, if he discovers this before he has undergone his procedure of shaving off the hair, so then he becomes tameh. Nothing to be done about it. He has to purify himself, shave off the hair, restart the Nazirut. But this is the unique feature of the Nazir. He has already shaved off the hair. And then he discovers, I became defiled a few days ago. So if it's Tumah Yeduah, Tumah that someone knew about, he didn't know about it, but the world knew about it, someone in the world knew about it, nothing to be done. His shaving has become disqualified because he shaved in order to end his Nazirut, and in the end, it turns out he was defiled. He has to restart his Nazirut. But if no one knew about it, then we say what you didn't know and what no one in the world knew didn't hurt you. Since it's like after the fact, after he already, as it were, has ended his Nazirut. That's this unique concept of Nazirut. In the course of discussing that, and this is the point with which we'll conclude, in the course of discussing that, the Mishnah talks about different ways in which he may or may not have encountered the corpse. He went into the water. He doesn't know. Did he touch the corpse? Did he not touch the corpse? So the Mishnah says it depends on the circumstances. And in certain circumstances, we say it's almost definite that he must have touched the corpse. And that's called raglayim ladavar. Raglayim ladavar is a metaphor for the idea that we have a very strong basis to assume that it happened. It's not a 50-50 probability. Okay? It's 98-2. That's called raglayim ladavar. And then the Mishnah goes on to list other cases of raglayim ladavar, again relating to death defilement. What happens if you encounter an unmarked grave somewhere out in the field? Do I have to worry that maybe there's another unmarked grave somewhere else? Becomes a whole burial grounds, or can I just assume it's someone happened to bury him in this place? Again, depending on what I find, there could be cases of raglayim ladavar. I have basis for assuming that there are other burial spots in the area. Okay, or safek nigaim. Remember, we touched on the mitzorah, who, like the Nazir, has to shave his hair. So here you have a safek mitzorah, and one and from safek mitzorah, the Mishnah goes into safek zav, and once again comes up with a case of raglayim ladavar. When he sees the emission in a certain kind of a setting, okay, so then we assume that raglayim ladavar. Okay, okay, and finally a case of murder. Now notice how most of these have to do with death. And all of them have to do with cases of uncertainty, but uncertainty that under certain circumstances we can resolve because of raglayim ladavar. And again, the connection between uncertainty and death seems to me to be very telling. Now, why would Tractate Nazir want to end with this idea of the connection, the nexus between uncertainty and death? Okay, that we'll have to leave for the next class. The next class will be devoted primarily to Masechet Sotah, but we'll devote the first few minutes to a few concluding remarks about Tractate Nazir. So, Erev Tov to everyone.
Erev Tov. Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, as last class was rescheduled because of the holiday, I do want to make sure that people know that they can, in fact, watch that class. There is a rough cut that I am posting in chat right now, the Facebook link, and there should be a video on YouTube within the week. And if there may be a chance that the next class is rescheduled similarly, if that happens, I will notify you all by email of the date, time, and when you can expect a recording to be available. Happy learning. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.